An attorney who's written on civil rights and individual rights matters. He's from my part of the country originally. He's former assistant district attorney in Manhattan, and now he's an attorney in Denver, David Kopel.
Good morning. Today I'd like to talk about some of the parallels between the gun rights movement in the 1980s and 1990s and another great civil rights movement in our country's history, the movement for racial justice in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. One of the first things I want to stress is the fact that you're right on the constitutional issue doesn't in itself get you very far. Anybody who gives the Second Amendment an honest reading and looks at the historical evidence and the kinds of facts that are normally used in the Supreme Court cases and all the normal kinds of evidence that's used in construing the Constitution has to conclude that the Second Amendment guarantees an individual right. But that's fairly meaningless to the other side because they say, you know, so what? The Constitution says that, well, we can ignore the Constitution. The great rule of constitutional construction is that inconvenient parts don't count. That was the same kind of philosophy that people fighting for racial equality had to face. After the Civil War, Congress and the states enacted the 14th Amendment, which outlawed states discriminating on the basis of race, and enacted the 15th Amendment, which barred states from forbidding people to vote on the basis of race. Completely clear. There was no real legitimate intellectual doubt about what those amendments mean. Those amendments were enacted in the early 1870s, and it wasn't until the late 1940s and early 1950s when courts got around to enforcing them. For 80 years in between, those amendments were basically nullified. The government didn't believe in them. The blacks were shut out of the political process, so they had no means of enforcing them. And the courts, being basically subservient to the same kinds of political structures that ran the legislatures, weren't interested in enforcing them. So for 80 years, we had crystal clear in the Constitution that the government couldn't racially discriminate, and for 80 years we had racial discrimination as the routine. Now, one of the things, when you start going around promoting civil rights, people are going to try and attack you as someone who's outside the mainstream, as someone who's crazy. If you lived in Tuscaloosa in 1948 and belonged to the NAACP, the National Association for Colored People, which was the vanguard and civil rights organization, people would think you were nuts. If you live in New York City today and you belong to the National Rifle Association, people think the same thing. And it's not only that they think you're sort of far out, but that the other side will deliberately launch vituperative attacks on you and your organizations to try and paint you as not just someone with whom there's a legitimate disagreement over policy, like should we raise capital gains or lower them. They won't let you into that kind of dialogue of a legitimate debate. They'll say merely by belonging to this civil rights organization, you are the scum of the earth. One of the tactics they used in the 1950s and 1960s was to say that the NAACP and the other racial justice organizations were communist fronts. That all these groups, you know, they say, oh, they're just for racial equality, but they're really commies. They're really subversive agents of the Soviet Union. You get the same kind of thing today. Some of you have probably seen the ad about handgun control. It shows a Ku Klux Klansman in full hooded regalia carrying an AR-15. And it says, why is the NRA making it easy for him to get guns? So what they're saying is that by belonging to the NRA, by supporting the NRA's opposition to gun bans, you're on the side of the Ku Klux Klan. The ad goes on to talk about the Klan, about the neo-Nazi skinheads, about people who murder policemen. According to Handgun Control, if you belong to a gun rights organization, that's the kind of person you are. Handgun Control doesn't want a legitimate debate on the gun issue. They want to paint people who believe in our rights as extremist kooks. Now, one of the things you'll also hear in both kinds of civil rights contexts is, well, what about a little registration? In the 1950s and 60s, states like Alabama and Arkansas passed laws saying if you work for the public schools, you have to give the superintendent a list of all the organizations you belong to. And likewise, they'd say, Alabama passed a law saying if you belong to various organizations like the NAACP, just give us a list of all your members. Not that we want to do anything for it, we just want to keep an eye on it. You know, we're passing this law because Arkansas wants to make sure the public school teachers aren't putting too much time into the fundraising drive for the symphony. That's why we want to find out about what organizations they're in. Well, in fact, the purpose of registering people who belong to the NAACP, including school teachers, was to harass them. If they're school teachers, you can fire them on some other pretext. If they're just ordinary members, well, the NAACP list pretty soon ends up in the sheriff's office, which pretty soon ends up in the Ku Klux Klan office, since they were usually the same thing. And the NAACP members end up getting murdered in the middle of the night. But of course, it's only registration, so who can be against that? And we get the same kind of things in guns. We don't want to take your guns, we just want to know who you are and register them. Well, it turns out once they find out who you are, then they try and take the guns. In Illinois last year, there was a proposal to confiscate semi-automatics, and the confiscation would be effectuated by going to every gun dealer, getting a list of the 4473 forms that people fill out when they register the gun by buying it from a retail dealer, and then going house-to-house searches and confiscating it. In Washington, D.C., they've had a law that you have to register guns for a long time, and the city, one of the city councilmen said, why don't we ban all the guns? And another city councilman says, well, you know, we enacted the registration law with a promise that we wouldn't use it for confiscation. And the gun banner said, well, I never promised him that. There's also an operation going on you may have heard about called Operation Forward Trace. That's where the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms goes to a gun dealer, gets a list of everyone who's bought what they call a so-called assault weapon, and then goes and investigates it. It's completely illegal. It's specifically forbidden by federal law to use the 4473 for something other than a direct criminal investigation for somebody they already have suspicion against, but they're doing it anyway. When you start letting the government register you for exercising your constitutional rights, you can bet trouble's around the corner. Now, one of the other things that people say is, well, okay, I'll acknowledge you got some civil rights, but you have to be so intense about it. In the 1940s and 50s and 60s, people were saying, okay, all right, we'll tell you what, maybe it's okay if the state law school's integrated. But no, we don't want to like integrate the high schools or the kindergartens and have our little children going to school with Negroes. You know, maybe if you're a law student, maybe you're old enough to handle something like that. And they were telling the civil rights movement, you know, calm down, you're upsetting everybody, stop making it so intense, stop having all these street demonstrations and getting people riled up. And you get the same kind of attitude about gun rights. You know, former Chief Justice Warren Burger, who was appointed to the court to basically with the idea of restricting people's rights because the Constitution had gone too far, wrote an article in Praise saying, well, you know, the Second Amendment doesn't mean anything. It means we can have a National Guard. But anyway, just out of common sense, nobody would question the right of people to own hunting guns and fishing rods. Well, you know, that's wonderful that he's found a constitutional right to stick hooks in the mouths of fishes, but there's really not much to it in the Constitution. And he's for that kind of moderate thing that he thinks of as, you know, your basic older conservative white male. Oh, hunting's a nice, moderate, reasonable thing, but the thought of like a black person in the ghetto owning a cheap handgun, or the thought of somebody having a semi-automatic, oh, that's too extreme. That's not a moderate approach to civil rights like Mr. Berger likes. There is one nice benefit to working in the civil rights movement. If you participated in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, you got to work alongside outstanding pro-rights organizations like the Congress on Racial Equality, headed by Roy Innis. And if you work for gun rights in the 1990s, you also get to work alongside outstanding civil rights organizations like the Congress for Racial Equality, headed by Roy Innis. One of the biggest things that the other side doesn't want to do is they don't want to discuss the real issues. When somebody was coming and saying, well, you know, why shouldn't the bus stations in the Deep South be integrated? Why shouldn't a black person be able to get on a bus and go from Memphis to Atlanta the same way a white person can? Well, the other side knew that, you know, that kind of concept was pretty much in accordance with the common sense, even of a lot of people in the South. So they would distract the issue and say, these civil rights people, what they're after is they want to have sex with your white children. They're after desegregation, about interracial marriage, and about raping, having big black men coming and raping your little white daughters. That's the issue they wanted to talk about to get people all hysterical and frightened. And the same kind of thing comes up here. We say, we support the right of people to keep and bear arms for personal defense. And handgun control doesn't want to argue about that. They say, see, they're for cop killer bullets. They're for shooting down policemen and little children in the streets and blood in the streets and gore and hysteria. You better stop them right now because they want to kill us all. Well, let me shift from the broad issue to one of the civil rights battles that's going on right now in my home city of Denver, Colorado. Last November, the city council, let me backtrack a little bit. In March of 1989, a convicted felon and cocaine addict named Eugene Thompson stole a fully automatic MAC-11 from somebody's house, and a while later shot up a suburban neighborhood and raped and killed a couple of people. It was a full automatic. The evening that happened, City Councilwoman Kathy Reynolds said, "We've got to do something about this," and announced her plan to ban semi-automatics. Not that one had anything to do with the other, except that a crime perpetrated with a full automatic is a good excuse to ban semi-automatics. Well, in November 1989, the City Council looked at a gun ban, a semi-automatic ban. Roy Innes from the Congress on Racial Equality came out and testified against it. Dennis Ray Martin of the American Federation of Police testified against it. Leroy Pyle of Law Enforcement for the Protection of the Second Amendment testified against it. 300 people from Denver testified against it. About 1,000 others showed up just to watch the thing and express their disagreement. Even the American Civil Liberties Union of Colorado, while not taking a stand on the gun issue itself, told the City Council that the law was so badly drafted that it couldn't be enacted in its current form. None of that mattered to the City Council. They enacted it anyway. The ban has made Denver a great deal safer because in its inept form, which is basically a photocopy of an earlier draft of the Los Angeles gun ban, it bans certain guns that don't even exist. In Denver, you can no longer own the Coleco M900 assault carbine, and I'm happy to say everyone in Denver is complying with that because there's no such gun. Now, for the guns that do exist, there has been a good deal of civil disobedience. There was a grace period of 60 days whereby people who owned the guns were allowed to register them. They couldn't buy any more, but if you had a gun, you could register within that 60-day period. Only 1% of gun owners who had the relevant guns registered them. And that's a sort of a tradition that when the government says you can't do something, like in the 1960s, the state of Connecticut said that married couples couldn't use birth control, and many states in the Deep South said that people of different races couldn't have sex with each other. People basically ignored laws like that and said, well, it's my human rights, and screw the government. Both the Second Amendment Foundation and the National Rifle Association are suing the city of Denver over this gun ban, continuing the tradition of filing lawsuits in support of civil rights that the NAACP started in the 1940s and 50s. The plaintiffs in the lawsuit are, among them, some very sympathetic people. One is a 110-pound woman who needs an M1 carbine for self-defense because it's got low recoil and it's light and easy to control. She lives in a gang-infested neighborhood where people burn cars on her street. One of the plaintiffs is part of a family of Holocaust survivors who's been threatened by the Nazis because they lecture about the Holocaust. That case was filed last January and set for trial in February. Now, one of the unfortunate things about the civil rights battle is, after you've won, everybody's for you. Now even Justice Robert Bork, potential Justice Robert Bork, said that the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, which said that public schools couldn't be segregated, was correctly decided. Even though he was basically hostile to almost all forms of civil rights, he said, oh yeah, I agree with that one. But back when that was decided, most people, especially in the law enforcement establishment in the relevant areas, were against it. And we're having that same kind of thing coming up now with civil rights, with gun rights. The law enforcement establishment, I don't want to speak of like law enforcement officers in general, but the kinds of people who get to be appointed police chiefs or legal officers are hostile to civil rights because it's hostile because it's an interference with their power structure. You have people like Attorney General John Van de Kamp, the highest law enforcement officer of California, who allies himself with a guy like Mike Bruce, when Bruce was asked if his semi-auto ban was constitutional, Bruce replied, to hell with the Constitution. That was the side John Van de Kamp came in on, hired a public relations firm to help him pass a gun ban in California. You have people like Ari Zavaris, the police chief in Denver, who doesn't believe that civilians should own guns, and was substantially responsible for helping implement the Denver gun ban. Now the funny thing is, we've got a very strong right to bear arms in Colorado, in the Colorado Constitution. And so the gun ban says, we're not interfering with your constitutional rights, because these aren't defensive guns. These are offensive weapons. They're not necessary for defensive purposes. They're only good for massacring lots of innocent people at once. And then the funny thing that in there, this gun ban supported by Chief Zavaris, is it says civilians can't own these guns, but police officers can. So it's okay if you have a massacre in Denver as long as it's a public sector massacre. Quite frequently, you go to the law enforcement officers and ask for protection of your civil rights. They won't hear you. In 1957, Daisy Bates, who was, her husband was a newspaper publisher in Little Rock, Arkansas, and she was the head of the local chapter of the NAACP, was leading the fight for school integration there. She was receiving death threats from the Ku Klux Klan. She called up Attorney General Herbert Brownell, President Eisenhower's Attorney General, and said, can you do something? Can you help me out? And he said, no, I'm sorry, that's not a federal issue. Why don't you go to your local state police? And, of course, the state police were buddies with the people who were sending her all the death threats. Her response was then her husband got out his Colt 45 and sat guard on the porch every night, and nothing happened to him. You do, fortunately, have good attorney generals and people who will stand up for your rights. After the Eisenhower administration, President Kennedy came in, and his Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, vigorously fought for civil rights and worked hard to protect those kinds of people. On the gun rights issue, you've got people like Attorney General Corbin in California, who have very vigorously defended, Attorney General Corbin in Arizona here, who have vigorously defended our right to bear arms. And in Colorado, we've got the same kind of thing going on with our Attorney General, Dwayne Woodard. In Colorado, the law says that when there's a suit against a municipal ordinance and the constitutionality of that ordinance is called into question, the Attorney General is allowed to intervene in the suit and express his opinion on the constitutionality. Well, on September 14th, 1990, Dwayne Woodard, the Attorney General of Colorado, sued the city of Denver over the gun ban. The lawsuit filed by the Attorney General says that the Denver gun ban violates 4 separate sections of the Colorado Constitution. It first of all violates the inalienable rights section, which guarantees people the right to defend their lives and property. It second of all violates a prohibition on ex post facto laws. An ex post facto law is when you make something illegal without giving people a chance to comply. For example, if I enacted a law that says only boga ties are legal, all other ties are unlawful immediately, and then proceeded to arrest these 2 gentlemen, that would be an ex post facto law, because I didn't even give them a moment to take the tie off. Well, that's what the city council did in Denver with magazines. They said no magazines of 21 or more rounds, effective immediately, no chance to dispose of them, no grace period to sell them or take them out of the city anyway. If they're now illegal, you all have them, you're all criminals. That's an ex post facto law. That violates the state constitution. The third grounds for the lawsuit is the core issue that the Constitution guarantees the right to keep and bear arms for personal and civil defense or for civil defense. And semi-automatics are obviously very well suited for both purposes. And finally, the law, because it's so ineptly and vaguely drafted, people can't even tell what it means. And for that reason, it violates the due process protections of the Colorado Constitution. Nobody in Colorado knows if this law covers the Mini 14. The city attorney won't tell people. They say, excuse, is the Mini 14 covered by the law? He won't say. Well, the media got a hold of this, and they had an interesting reaction. The biggest play we've gotten for this lawsuit came in the Denver Post last Thursday. The Denver Post endorsed Dwayne Woodard for re-election because of his stand on the Denver lawsuit. The Post said, we like Woodard because he's fair and independent. He used to be a Republican, but even when he was a Republican, he wouldn't let the Republican state legislature encroach on the constitutional authority of the Democratic governor. Then in 1987, Woodard switched parties and became a Democrat. And this year he angered some Democrats by challenging the Denver gun ban, which the Post said clearly violates at least 2 explicit guarantees of the Colorado Constitution. As the Post put it, when some infuriated liberals came to Woodard and reminded him that gun control was in their party platform, he quietly replied that his duty to the Constitution came ahead of party loyalty. border front, I'm happy to report that things are going fairly well in Colorado. But let me end this speech where I began, and that's to say that while we're going to win some victories in the courts, and it's important to fight in the courts, that can't be the primary place we look for vindication of our rights. And Mr. Fernandez is completely right that you get rights not by the government giving to you, but by boldly asserting them. The free speech in this country didn't really exist until the 1920s, when groups like the International Workers of the World, the American Federation of Labor, and other organizations said, well, I don't care if there's a law banning demonstrations. We're going to go out on the streets and have a free speech labor demonstration. They did it, and a lot of them got arrested, and a lot of them went to jail. But after about 15 years, the courts got around to starting to respect freedom of speech. The 14th and 15th Amendments were ignored for 80 years, till black people and their white allies began saying, we've had enough of gradualism and moderation. We're going to start having lunch counter sit-ins and mass demonstrations and marches on Washington and tell people to start obeying our rights. That's the way we're going to protect our gun rights. If everybody here becomes an activist and works hard and writes letters to the editor and writes to Congress and does everything that they can, that's the way we're going to get our rights respected. Thank you.
Or would-be gun owners navigate through the arcane laws in New York City so they can get permits to carry.